Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast. I'm Gemma Creagh and I'm chatting with director Alan Gilsenan about his wonderful documentary, The Ghosts of Baggotonia. So thank you so much for chatting with us.
A pleasure. Delighted to.
So it's a gorgeous film, and I just was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about its inception. Like, I know it's a real art project. I read the director's notes and you've got a good sense of the world, but it's very distinct in style. So tell me a little bit about like what your ideas for starting off were and if it stayed true to that as you went along.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always kind of start any film on a kind of instinct. You know, sometimes people think you have a very clear idea, but for me, it's always just, it's a kind of instinct, and I kind of find the film in the process of making it. And with this, with The Ghosts of Baggotonia, it kind of had, I suppose, there were three kind of strands to it. One was many, many years ago when I was in Trinity, I got a scholarship, which was in honour of a great man called Con Leventhal, who was a really close friend of Samuel Beckett's. He was a drama critic, sort of a man of Baggotonia in a way. And so I always, you know, because that scholarship, always had this kind of curiosity about Con Leventhal. And the scholarship was organised by another friend of both Leventhal's and Beckett's, a man, wonderful man called Professor Owen O'Brien, who's a very eminent cardiologist, but also a great man of letters and has written a lot on literary themes. And it was really, Owen introduced me to the notion of Baggotonia, you know, the idea that there was this place, this kind of geographic space, which sort of radiated out from the canal and Baggot Street. If you saw Baggot Street Bridge, anybody who knows it as a crossroads, Baggotonia radiates out from that central point. And I suppose I knew a little bit about it. I knew all the headlines, you know, the kind of presence of Patrick Kavanagh and Brendan Behan and Flann O'Brien. And then I suppose talking to Owen and reading his own writing about Baggotonia, I realized, you know, that there was this entire kind of movement of artists, writers that grew up as a kind of counterculture, you know, in the 40s, 50s, and echoing into the 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps, of kind of wild artists who were living a life kind of in contradiction to the kind of Catholic mores of the time. And that time and all those artists, many of whom are forgotten, I think definitely represents a kind of cultural movement. So that was one strand, and really Owen O'Brien needs to take the credit for that. So the second strand was I also was introduced through Owen to a wonderful artist, kind of largely forgotten now, called Nevill Johnson. And Nevill was originally from Manchester, but moved to Belfast and finally came down to Dublin. And he was primarily a visual artist, a painter, extraordinary painter, also a writer and a photographer. And Nevill took these extraordinary photographs with a Leica camera in the 50s of Dublin. I suppose like a lot of outsiders, he came to Dublin and he realized that there was something precious in this area that he was going to document with these extraordinarily beautiful, thousands of beautiful black and white photos of the area, of Baggotonia and wider area. And, you know, I kind of liked, I mean, the photographs are stunning, beautiful. Many of them are in the film, but also I liked the idea of Nevill. So that was the second strand. The third strand was a bit more personal, which is that I grew up in what is called Baggotonia. I grew up in Raglan Road, you know, the now mythical Raglan Road. And, you know, my childhood was wandering those streets, and it was very strange and kind of wonderful place at that time. Not so much as it is now, where, you know, every square meter of Dublin 4 and Dublin 2 is now kind of, you know, is kind of worth a fortune, and everything's been changed and cleaned up. And, you know, there was a kind of more magic about it, or at least that's how I remember it. So it was those three strands of kind of this kind of memoir of my own childhood and rediscovering that and that place, with earlier echoes from the kind of writers, and kind of also then visually inspired by Nevill Johnson. So that's a very long answer to
no, it's perfect, because it is, you do get the strands, like where it's paying homage to these literary giants, then translating it's not the right thing, but kind of taking their work and looking at it in a fresh way with your own visuals in a visual poem style, and how that integrates back through their lives and back through the place as it is now. And then what I found as a viewer very jarring, but enjoyable, like in an enjoyable way, was how you're looking at something and you don't know if you're tricked, if this was an original thing from like the olden past, and then something will reveal, actually no, this is completely modern day, or someone will walk into shot and you're like, oh okay, no, this is not archival, this is newly recorded, or the poem even is a modern piece and not, like looking back. And I was like, actually it was very sort of intricate, so you were sort of, as a viewer, like figuring out a lot of stuff, because like, okay, some of the classics, yes, I would know, but then there were voices in there that I wouldn't necessarily be too familiar with. I'm not au fait with a lot of those works, so I was like, it was just very interesting.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, first of all, it's not, for listeners, it's not a conventional documentary in any way. And I think a lot of people have called it film poem, and I think that's probably more accurate. And for me, I've always been interested in the idea of, the past and the present kind of coexisting, even the future, but that's probably another discussion. But, that in any one moment, in any one place, we carry the history, we carry the echoes, of what's happened before. I love that thing, if you can sit somewhere or walk down a lane, but also be aware of what's happened before. That there are lanes and streets and canals in Baggotonia, that Kavanagh walked down, that Beckett walked down, but that my mother and father had walked down, and millions of others, and that somehow the memory of those people, the memory of those experiences, all kind of coexist in some space, whether it's poetic or memory or however you want to articulate it. And the film tried to capture that a place isn't just a moment in time. It also carries its history. So what I tried to do with the film, and again, this kind of evolved and was very kind of instinctive process, was kind of interweave writings from these various writers and artists. As I mentioned before, the very famous ones, the Kavanagh, Brian, Beckett, Bean, but also less famous. It's interesting what history forgets. There's a lot of extraordinary writers that have fallen out of.
And women, that's you've great female voices in there that were strong and bold and that were amazing quotes, and that was gorgeous. I actually sent one to my brother. I was like, that's a really good, I never even heard of her.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the women, of course, you know more than I have, fell out of history, that there was an extraordinary movement of very radical women as well. Many of whom, again, have been forgotten. I mean, there's lots of people that we remember, the kind of Mary Lavin, Elizabeth Bowen, Maura Laverty. They people in that generation. A little later, people like Eavan Boland. But there were also many, many writers, and some I've tried to bring out in the film. Two poets, one, Ethna McCarthy, who is, I think she was a doctor, medical student, but also, I think, a wonderful poet, who seems very resonant to somebody like Sylvia Plath to me. But Ethna McCarthy was also, I think, an early love of Samuel Beckett, and some of Beckett's greatest love poems were written about her. And then she, in turn, later went on to marry Con Leventhal. But also people like Blanaid Salkeld, who there's a couple of her poems spoken by Camille O'Sullivan in the film. And, again, really, but there's huge amount of them. There's a wonderful book by an academic, Deirdre O'Brady, in Limerick, and she's written recently a wonderful book about the literary coteries of women in that time. Yeah.
But it was great to hear those voices and put on, and very much so naturally weaving through it, very on point with theme and they gave like this kind of broader sense of the world, where I do think, like, traditionally speaking, like, it has just been a place kind of celebrated for by men, and women maybe get a look in the
Yeah.
odd time. So like it was lovely to see that in there. And but I mean, it is the world. It was the scope of the world. What I found very interesting, and I know visual poem was the word that was thrown out, but I kind of get a more it was almost like not a frantic one. Like, I think that's but stream of consciousness, where there'd almost be a theme and a space, and you'd languish in that theme in space for a while. And I found that to be very interesting, because I feel like that's naturally how my mind works.
Mm.
You're twigged by something, and it might be by how religion has impacted the works, and we kind of sit there for a while and kind of like dwell in that theme before moving on to something. And it's not as structured as a chapter or an episodic piece, but it's more like you're going with this flow, and one thing kind of conjures another thing. And that's what I found to be very interesting. And then I was like, was that something that you knew it would take, that structure? Because that's something, again, that I haven't felt done that way too often before.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the same way, maybe poems have a certain inner logic, which isn't necessarily a narrative logic or a linear logic. I think in the process of editing this with my wonderful editor, Bjorn McGulla, who had a huge hand in this, yes, certain themes emerged, certain themes, whether it was love, whether it was drink, whether it was religion, whether it was kind of madness, whether it was death. And I tried to weave in some of the writings and the poems, also with my own kind of reflections on that time. Reflections that, it was interesting when I showed the film first to my sister, because there's various kind of meandering reflections on my own kind of childhood. And she said, well, no, that's wrong. Like, that's it, And, I like that idea that memory is kind of just what you preserve. And it's not even, sometimes what you preserve isn't true. And I like that kind of existence that, any of our experience the world is fluid. It's not, the factual events are part of it, but they're not exclusively part of it. Our memories, our feelings, and in a way, particularly in the past, all those merge and fuse. And I suppose I tried to do that in the film, and then, obviously to give it some structure, weave them around certain themes as we moved through.
And actually, that's very interesting, because I do think the way you look at the various subject matters, like, you kind of go, this is that life. You show us what we've always seen in that, this is this whimsical world of creativity, of people's drinking and having pints. And then you kind of go into, there's like actually a kind of darker side to it, where it's, excess and like what would have been considered to be amorality at the time. And then you can kind of, I don't know, you kind of get like this little twinge of the toll that it took on them, where they were kind of, and then also, like, you're going, these are these amazing figures who've done such beautiful works, but then there were also kind of lecherous old lads hanging out in a pub chasing after like young women in their 20s. And it was like, and you get all that in there, and I was like, do you know what, that's it did feel like a much more rounded view, where you're not going, it's not all great, it's not all bad, it's complex. Like, that's
no, I think you're right. And I think, I think there's always a danger of sentimentality with these things, and I want to avoid that. And I think many of the writers I feature, sentimentality would be something they'd abhor. But there was a darkness. There were obviously fantastic times, but part of those fantastic times, of course, was drink, and drink, killed many of them. And there was darkness, and there was violence, and I think that whole canvas of life had to be celebrated, and there's various allusions, even to, I remember as a child growing up, occasionally there'd be a body discovered in the canal. We can romanticize the canal, of course, and it's beautiful. And, we can think of Patrick Kavanagh and Leafy with love banks and all that. But also as a child, I remember these strange kind of bits of news that you'd hear, that a dismembered body was found in a suitcase, or, and also at the time, it's changed now, thankfully in some ways, I guess, but that area around Baggot Street and Fitzwilliam Square and Mount Street, very beautiful, elegant part of Dublin, during the day, celebrated, of course, by people like Louis MacNeice as well. But at night, when I was young, it was lined with prostitutes, and there was a whole darkness and another kind of side to it. So in a way, I was trying to not celebrate, but incorporate all those aspects, that I think there's a lovely phrase. I think Owen O'Brien might use it in the film, where he talks about Beckett and Beckett realizing, before he moved to Paris, that the snog in a pub could also be the tomb, that drink could liberate you and free you in certain ways, but it could also kill you.
Yeah, and you do get the tapped the drama underneath it all, I think, and that's something that's like, it's not whitewashed out. It's not going, oh, they were like, you're actually like, it is sort of pouring gasoline on a fire, where obviously like these are people that are creative but also deeply troubled. And I was like, it was an interesting watch in that way. And I think one of the reasons why it was good, because it wasn't just one like hero's journey story of this man made great, in which case you are likely to not look at the 360 of the situation. Like, you're telling it from everyone's point of view, you're telling it almost the place as a whole. So it's like it's a very different structure, I think, that we're used to, like, than that structure, but it felt very true.
Yeah, I generally, I think I'm drawn to, I mean, I've made all sorts of films, but in this sort of more experimental work, I'm kind of drawn to, almost, I always think of kind of analogies in music, like it's almost like jazz, that you kind of find your way through it, and, you're riffing on different things. And, I mean, I enjoy the linear narrative film as much as the next person, of course. But that's not always how life unfolds, and I think it's quite nice to, just to play with the form a bit. And, the actual making of this, much of it was made during lockdown and COVID, and much, and that had a strange feeling in the city anyway. And often I would go in very early in the morning. Often, I mean, the city was deserted anyway, but often at the weekends when it was really deserted. And I would just literally walk the area, endlessly, kind of committed to kind of walking everywhere, every small alleyway, down the canals, back roads, down wastelands, just with this small Leica camera, and film as I went along, and just respond to what I saw. And, and that, of course, is very liberating, as opposed to going out with a big crew and, you have 10 hours and you've got to shoot such and such. Yeah.
And just like that artist, the photographer, that like, that's like, you are sort of walking in his footsteps, just telling it from a very different perspective, and the creative observing the creatives. Like, that's an interesting kind of way to kind of observe this. It's like it's once removed. So it's very someone who's part of that world.
Emotionally too. I often think what strikes you visually, if you're shooting any film, there's a kind of emotional response. Why does a certain light at a certain time in a certain place move you to film as opposed to someone else? And also I did like the idea of that Nevill had walked the streets. And I remember going through his archive in UCD, and he was very meticulous. In lots of ways, you could have seen him as a kind of chaotic artist, but, looking at his notebooks, which is kind of intimate, you could see he was very meticulous in noting what he did and when he did it and how he did it. And to walk in his footsteps, there was one lovely little synchronicity we discovered. This film was funded by the Arts Council. And I think Nevill Johnson would have got a grant from maybe the very first Arts Council for that Leica camera. And here we were all those years later, also with a Leica monochrome camera, which only shoots black and white. It doesn't shoot color. kind of walking the same streets, and that was, again, he was one of the ghosts on my shoulder, and that was a lovely kind of feeling. Yeah. And it was also nice. I mean, I live in Wicklow now. It's not like, I'm returning to my home place from deepest Latin America or something. I pass through that area all the time, but there is something different to stopping and walking and consciously, rather than rushing up Baggot Street to meet somebody about something, that I was actually walking the kind of streets of my childhood with a view to listening out or absorbing the past or remembering the past. And it's interesting in anybody's life, what you remember, if you went, that feeling when anybody returns to, say, the house they grew up in as a child, what sparks a memory? It's not always the obvious thing. And it's quite interesting to have the pleasure of doing that, to actually just wander and listen and think.
And do you feel the space of moving out helps you see it clearly, or would you be able to turn an objective eye to that space anyway, like if you had stayed there?
I think it's it's that idea of actually, considering something. We're all busy, we're all running all the time, and we rarely give ourselves the time to look or listen, which in the end of the day is kind of key to filmmaking. And I think it's just that conscious effort of saying, okay, now, I have walked Baggot Street, 10,000 times in my life, maybe more. But this one time, this dawn on a Sunday morning, I will walk it with a kind of attention, with a kind of conscious looking, and I do think that's kind of fundamental to any kind of filmmaking. It sounds kind of banal, but that you actually look and listen. And it's not always what you want or what you think or what you imagine. It's to look and listen. What's there, and then what's that telling you?
And a little bit about that process of getting it. So you were kind of walking it with the camera. Would you feed footage? Like, is it something that you would have just done a shoot and you're like, I want to get this, and this, and this? Would it be something you're editing as you're going along instead?
Yeah, there was a certain amount of editing as we went along, but there was also, it's also not necessarily, want. It's what kind of would reveal itself. I try to, of course, there's all sorts of practical considerations come into play, but I try, particularly in a film like this, to be as open to it, to see, well, what's presenting itself to me, what, rather than what I'm trying to force onto it. What am I learning? What am I seeing, that I mightn't have seen before? And what memory is that sparking? And, the same applied when I was reading through the writers that are involved in the film. What strikes me, rather than, obviously we have kind of some of the greatest hits, obviously we have Patrick Kavanagh, sort of singing Raglan Road, but also I tried to look at the writings, not always going for the greatest hits, but little moments that kind of spark a memory, and even small moments of the writers that kind of aren't necessarily to the center of the canon. The critics like John Jordan, many people who've written about the area, about their John Ryan, of course, who was a famous character. People who wrote about their own memories and their own experiences, and just to kind of try and weave all that together.
And so you were saying this was kind of like you were editing as you're going along. How long did it take?
A long time. I'm never quite sure when things start and when they finish. Well, I'm kind of sure when they finish, but not always. But I suppose partly because of COVID kind of delayed things as well. It was probably over a couple of years. I would have taken some footage. I would have started to read, but then gradually, things evolve. I couldn't really even put an exact time on it. It would be
And just so, would you have done a very rough cut yourself and then brought it to Bjorn to edit it? Because if that's that kind of, I presume he's not on call for that
No,
amount of time.
no. Well, he might feel like that, but no. I would, you know, I wouldn't do a rough cut. I would, you know, I've a great belief in the creativity of the editor, and they're, you know, filmmakers are always gone on about the collaborative art, you know, which is another way of saying it's really all about me, you know. But I really think everybody involved in the film, but editors in particular, are, you know, they're a great creative force, and often in the case of say Bjorn, I would give him, you know, the material, and maybe we discuss general ideas, and then, you know, he'd bring his own spin to it, which would be, you know, exciting and fresh, and then, you know, we just tease it back and forth. There's no, at least for me, there's no kind of formal plan. It emerges, yeah.
Gorgeous. And then to get those effects and the layerings up, I presume, is that like something again that's happening as you're going through, or would that be something that Bjorn would do, or would that be something that you'd send off to get effects done? You know, you want this layered. Like how does it work? Because it's,
I mean, Bjorn would do probably a rough pass at it, and then, you know, again, you know, talking about the kind of creative people involved, you know, I've worked a lot with Outer Limits, which are a great post-production house in Dublin, but Eugene McChrystal there, who would be, you know, on this, the online editor, and the colorist or grader, you know, you'd bring your idea to him. Okay, Eugene, well, this is the kind of the idea, you know, it's going to mix here. But then he brings a whole layer of complexity, says, no, well, let's have a look at this. Let's try that. And that's another leap. And then, you know, on this particular project and others, but John Foley, who is a wonderful, wonderful graphic designer, you know, and I think people often think, oh, graphics, he's a guy that comes up at the end and puts on the credits. But John is a real kind of creative partner in this.
because there's almost animation stuff through it. Like it's very kind of textured as as images go.
And John would really engage in the subject and the theme and the fonts, and he's like another creative visual artist in it, you know. So we might have, myself and Bjorn might think, oh, well, we'd love, you know, to have these words of text here, but then John brings another layer of intelligence and wonderful creativity, you know. And then I suppose the last person in that kind of landscape of creativity is Brian Crosby, who did the music, you know, just an extraordinary musician. And that's another joy, whereby, you know, you bring your finished film or your locked picture to him, and then he brings a whole layer of, you know, emotion and beauty and musicality, you know, which is kind of, and I don't tend to interfere with that. You know, there's something mysterious about music, and like, I would be a great believer, you know, and not like, okay, I want you to reproduce the guide, or okay, here I want the music to go up and I want this to happen. And you know, the composing of music is almost like a response to the film, or it's a, you know, again, something like jazz. It's like it's one instrument responding to another. And, you know, I'd very much trust, you know, the composers, you know, that I've worked with. You know, I've done a lot also with Ray Harman, you know, and other people. But Brian, you know, he just brought his own kind of layer to the film, you know, which I was really thrilled with, you know. And he has great intelligence and ability, but great sensitivity to the process.
There's a real range in the soundscape to this. There's a real range in the style of music. There's like, again, like it's lovely, it's layered. Then you do get that kind of, it's integrated with the sound mix so well. And I'm like, just, would that be part of the process back and forth with him and the post-production, or is that all him?
No, I mean, absolutely. The sound designer and kind of mixer, Stephen McHale, you know, again, he's also a musician, but he would bring his layer. You know, I think the sound design is almost like um, it's like another musical track, and I know himself and Brian would have talked back and forth, and it's very important in any film that the sound design and the music complement. They're not like two children fighting for attention. They're two complementary forces. And of course nowadays, there is a place where sound design and music kind of meet. They're not distinct, different silos. And all those layers of artistry, mix. And I love that, combination of talents coming together. And I think at its best, it doesn't always happen, but at its best, it's to find a group of people with individual skills. Of course, normally there'd be a wonderful cinematographer, but anyway.
Well, there was yourself, yes. and then that lovely archive.
Out on the street, but yeah, that mix of people, I think, is really lovely, and I love that. And a lot of the time, people think directing is about getting what you want or controlling things, and actually, sometimes it's that, but usually, you have to do that when your team isn't perhaps what you hoped. But at its best, I think directing is allowing these disparate talents to come together, and actually, in my experience, the really good people, all that happens quite gently, and much of it unspoken, and in this case, it was very much that Bjorn and Brian and Stephen, and John Foley, they all come together quietly and just, weave their own magic in it. My producer, Martin Mann, also kind of great friend who I've known since my early days in Trinity, he, did a really deep dive into the archive. And, while we haven't depended on archive in this film, there is a lot of kind of very new, some of it unseen archive, which I think was really important.
And actually, I wanted to ask a little bit about clearing the rights for stuff like that. Like, I mean, I know real art, like it's a good budget, but it's, again, for a feature, I'm sure it gets very tight. And if you're processing film and, you're working with so many kind of good level creatives, like I'm sure, fiscal things cost a lot to organize. Was it difficult clearing the rights for everything? Were you able to get everything you wanted?
Probably not. I mean, it is very difficult, and increasingly so. Like everything, things have become more legalistic and more, and I think now, maybe because other streams of income are kind of constricting, archive has become a huge, many years ago when I started, you could probably talk to somebody and say, what to use this, and, it's low budget, and, people say grand, whereas now it's become very, very stringent, takes a huge amount of time on the part of the producer, or archive researcher, to clear things, often to find things. The irony is it's easy enough, you can go to our friends in the archive in the IFI, or, where other places, RT, BBC, Pathé, and it's easy enough to find the obvious pieces. But then often if you find something fresh or original, it's sometimes even hard to trace who owns that, not alone pay for it. So, there's a huge amount of work in that. And I think for anybody who's beginning in film, particularly in documentary film, that my advice for what it's worth would be to start early on that, because it takes, and it's often kind of detective work, literally, and Martin's very good at this. It's just literally detective work, trying to find it first of all, then trying to find who can agree to license it to you. And also, of course, you'll find sometimes a number of organizations are licensing the same piece of archive, which is complex and curious. But then it is very often very expensive, and in the kind of more modest areas, there were a lot of people on this that were very helpful to us as well, who liked the color of the project, and some of the writers' estates were very generous to us. And then, of course, Nevill Isdall's collection, not just the photographs, but all his kind of writings and work. Owen O'Brien was very kind in opening that door. Owen was a very key part of this in opening many doors to us.
God, so it's just similar to clearing music or clearing anything like that. Because you think like things that are so close to being out of copyright, if they're not already, there'd be a freedom there. But yeah, no, there's...
And it's more complex. As the years pass, it gets more difficult and more expensive. And, I think anybody who would see a documentary budget, particularly a historical documentary, I wouldn't know the figures or the percentages, but it always seems to me the archive is huge in most budgets. So yeah, start early. That's my advice. There's a lot of kind of online panic. Jesus, where's the have we cleared the such and such yet? And but anyway,
God,
we get
that's behind the curtain. Like it looks so seamless when it's up there, and you like it.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, say, maybe the difference between working on a project like this, that is, again, something so long form, so shifting and moving, and then something so, I would say, almost like difficult subject matter, something so linear and structured like The Meeting. Was that a very conscious choice to be doing one while the other because they're so different, or
what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think each project has its own kind of inner rhythm, and I like that. I like the difference. The Meeting was kind of unusual and strange in its own way. But even, one of the problems with directing, and I kind of like that side of it sometimes, but say if you do a relatively big feature film, an awful lot, which I enjoy and I like the logistics of that. But an awful lot of your time is spent managing, managing, emailing, organizing, controlling, and a small intimate film like this allows far more freedom, that actually sometimes in some productions, maybe more conventional productions, more traditional productions, I often think at the end of it, how much time did I, as the director, spend creatively, and how much time did I spend administratively, or organizationally, or and I often think that the creative time must be minuscule compared to the actual kind of management time, whereas actually in something like Ghosts of Baggotonia, nearly all the time was creative time.
Yeah, and it sounds very nurturing as well. Like it's very almost ethereal. Like it is dealing with these ghosts of creativity, and like a little bit of them peering over all of our shoulders as Irish creatives. That it's, like you're paying homage to these like larger than life characters, but also seeing the humanity in them, which is lovely.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, this was a lovely project to do. It's a small film. It's an experimental film. It's perhaps not for everyone, but I'm very proud of it, and I love the experience of it, and I'd also hope a lot of people who I've talked to, have lived in that area. It was a time when couldn't afford it now, but students would have lived there. People having bed sits in Fitzwilliam Square, or and so a lot of people who've kind of moved through the area in their life have very fond memories of it.
We're sure even McDade's, like, there's many a night I've had creative conversations over slightly gone off wine in McDade's, and that was the joy of it.
Yeah, totally. And so lots of people have a kind of affinity for the area, and one of the things, if it even happened a little bit, is that if you watch the film and then you go for a wander or you walk home or whatever, that you maybe just see that part of the city in a slightly different way, because the film hopefully may have just opened your eyes or your heart to it.
Yeah. And just tell me a little bit about, so it's released in the 9th. Where can people see it?
It's in the IFI in Dublin, in the Triskel in Cork, and Solas, or the Palace. Sorry, what am I talking about? The Palace in Galway. So perfect for me, perfect cinemas across the country, and sure, it'll last as long as people want to see it. But I'm kind of aware December's a kind of crazy time. So yeah, it opens on the 9th, and I think get in early would be my advice. But yeah, I think you often hear filmmakers, I'm sure nearly everybody you talk to says this, film is meant to be seen in the cinema. And that's not always true. But I do think there's something kind of immersive about this. And a few people have said to me, might have seen it online and then saw it in the cinema. That this, I think, really, even in a practical way, works in the cinema.
Oh, definitely. But thank you so much. It was such a beautiful film to watch. It was really lovely, and like that, so immersive, and again, it had just such a unique pacing and tone, and it was lovely. Like, it was really, as a viewer, a joy to watch, genuinely.
Very good, and lovely to talk to you.